Dude, never did it.
Welcome back to Never Did It. I'm Brad Garoon, and I'm here with Jake Ziegler. On Never Did It, we look back at the last 100 years of movie history in an effort to fill in some of our own movie blind spots. And today we're covering the year 1940. We got a couple of, what would you call them? Class criticism. No, that was last time. Today we've got a couple of comedies, two very different kinds of comedies for you, covering the year 1940. Let's start with the movie that you recommended for me, Jake. You assigned me His Girl Friday. Why did you do that?
Because it's just great. I hadn't seen it in a really, really long time, and so also because I know it's great, I also just really wanted to rewatch it because it had been a while, so I had some ulterior motives for assigning it. But it also shows up a lot on lists of greatest movies ever, greatest comedies ever. Quentin Tarantino has named it, one of his favorite movies ever. So it comes up a lot, and it's Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell, and they're just the chemistry is so great, and it's that kind of screwball comedy that that I really love that style. I think that you'd really like it too, and it's funny, it holds up, it's a lot of fun. I think you'd really like it, and it's similar to another movie that we'll hit a little bit later when we get to It Happened One Night for 1934. It's kind of similar to that. So,
well, a little bit further in this conversation, I want to talk about a movie it's very similar to because it's a remake of this movie. But before we get to that, I really liked it. Do you want to just real quick talk about, before I get into what I thought about it, do you want to talk about what it's about?
yeah, certainly. It's about journalism. Essentially, Cary Grant plays an editor of a newspaper, and he was at one time was married to Rosalind Russell, and they're no longer married, but she comes back in basically just to tell him that she's getting remarried, and that she's never going to be a journalist again. But at the same time that this is happening, a major news story is breaking, and he both sees an opportunity to keep her around for the purposes of trying to woo her back to back to him instead of marrying this other guy, but also to write this news story and be good for his newspaper. So he's basically starts using her for the to write the news story, and also to steal her from her new husband. So morally not great, but it's a good setup for some screwball fun.
So it's interesting. I've watched a bunch of Cary Grant movies lately, not for the podcast, just randomly because my father-in-law has been recommending them. This was also a movie. It worked out really well because he'd been pushing me to watch this too. He always It's funny because my introduction to him was in high school film class, North by Northwest, just like I think most people's introductions to him are, even though that's really close to the end of his career. This is much more like prime. He's very, very young, or looks very young in this, but he plays more characters like this than he plays characters like in North by Northwest, where here he's kind of conniving. I just watched Charade. It's very confusing whether he's a good guy or a bad guy throughout that movie. We mentioned recently, I watched with Grace Kelly, To Catch a Thief. That's what it's called, because he's a thief.
There we go.
Yeah, he plays like very much morally dubious characters in a lot of these movies. So by the time I got around to His Girl Friday, I wasn't so shocked by his moral gray area that he existed in. What I was shocked by is that Ralph Bellamy plays plays Hildy's fiance. Hildy is the reporter. And I was very surprised that Ralph Bellamy played it because we've talked about him on a previous episode. He was one of the evil old men in Trading Places. And this, I think, might be the first other movie I've seen him in. I could be wrong about that, but he doesn't, in my, speaking of blind spots, he has not popped up a lot for me. But here he is playing kind of a dope as Hildy's fiance Bruce, he takes the brunt of the punishment throughout the movie. He keeps getting like wrongly arrested for this, that, and the other thing, and that's where a lot of the comedy comes from.
Yeah, that poor guy, he just gets dumped on for the entire movie.
And he's a really nice guy. He wants to trust Walter. He wants to believe that he's a good guy, that he's going to help them get set up in their future life. And I'm really excited to talk about him as it compares to his counterpart in the remake, because it couldn't be more different. Yeah, it's fun. I don't know if I like this. I'll just be honest. I like the remake more for a few reasons. Some, I'm very biased. The remake is a Billy Wilder film it's called The Front Page, came out in 1974, which is our next episode. We're not covering The Front Page in the next episode, but 1974 we're doing next week. Billy Wilder wrote it with his longtime collaborator, IAL Diamond, and it stars Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau. It's one of the, I think, 4 collaborations that this team did together. Maybe 3. Maybe only 2. Maybe they only did The Fortune Cookie in this. Oh no, and then they did Buddy Buddy, which, speaking of Quentin Tarantino, as you earlier mentioned, Buddy Buddy is often the movie he cites as the reason he wants to retire before he's old, because it's not good. But the front page is good, even though he later in his career said that he regretted remaking His Girl Friday as the front page. I think that's a mistake. But we've said on this podcast before, it's interesting how history sort of lifts all boats. History is like the rising tide, where every movie can be found, like you can find in almost every movie, the opinion of it is elevated as time goes on. There's at least someone who likes it. And I am one of the someones who really likes the front page. But they gender swapped Hildy, where Jack Lemmon plays the Hildy character. He's Hildebrand, Hildy Johnson, and Walter Matthau as Walter Burns isn't in love with him, but just wants him for the paper and thinks this marriage will be a problem. And a very, very young Susan Sarandon plays the fiance.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and she's good.
That's that's pre Rocky Horror, isn't it?
I think it's like her second or third movie.
Yeah, wow.
And she's quite good in it. She doesn't get dumped on in quite the same way that Bruce gets dumped on in the original. She's a little bit more with it. But the general plot is exactly the same. They've got the guy on death row. They need the inside scoop. There's all the plotting. Like, it very much looks like a stage play, because a lot of it takes place in the press room across the street from the police stations, or the jail rather, and the gallows where he'll be hanged, excuse me.
Yeah, it's a pretty, for a screwball comedy that's really funny. And I think and I even think it's really funny, not like in a 1940s way, although some of it is funny in a 1940s way. Some of it's still just funny in a today way, where I think that's still just funny, and it's and it holds up. But really underneath, there's like some pretty serious stuff. Like, this guy, he's going to be hanged. I mean, it's a pretty serious undertone to a really funny movie.
He killed a cop, right? That's the idea.
Yes.
Yes, and and is it because he's a communist? Is that the deal?
Yeah, well, it's because he had the argument is that he had been brainwashed or something. Was that that was like the argument that they'd used in court or whatever. So
right.
Yeah.
And in the remake, which is a period piece, so it also I think it actually takes place in the 20s, not the 40s in the remake. It's the same thing. He was a communist, he killed a cop, but he's much less remorseful in the remake. And he's played by Austin Pendleton in the remake, which is a great character actor who always plays like a smarmy, sleazy little guy, very small. Did it really well. And the role of the prostitute character, although I don't think she's actually a prostitute in the original, but she's a prostitute in the remake, Molly Malloy, is played by Carol Burnett in the remake, and she's really like going for it in a way that Helen Mack in the original is playing it much more like realistically. They're both really good. I like the remake better, but yeah, I'm really glad you gave me this original, mostly because it gave me a reason to finally watch it and stop being told I need to see it.
Yeah, it's a 5-star for me. I love it. I remember loving it. Yeah, well, it's got the journalism ties. I love movies about journalism. I love movies that take place in the newsroom like this one does. I love all the side journalist characters, like the little peanut gallery that they keep going back to over and over again. I mean, it's I find it delightful.
Okay, let me run through a few journalism movies and see where they sit with you. You tell me how many stars. All the President's Men.
5 stars, easy.
Okay. Spotlight.
Probably the gold standard. Sorry, what was the second one?
Spotlight.
Spotlight, also 5 stars.
Okay, cool. Here's a challenging one for you. The Post.
The Post, 4 or 4.5. I thought it was very good. I really liked. I thought it was maybe a little underrated.
Wow, it's one of my least favorite Spielberg movies.
Yeah, I only saw it the one time at the theater, but I just remember thinking it was very good, and I haven't really thought about it much since.
I've been on this tear of watching Meryl Streep movies that are not good, which is always a bummer.
Have you watched Ricky and the Flash yet?
No, I haven't seen that one yet. But I watched The Iron Lady or The Iron Woman.
Oof, Iron Lady, yeah.
Yeah, and then I watched this, and I was like, The Post. But I also watched, you know what? And this is totally off subject. Where I'm sort of going down a rabbit hole here. Let Them All Talk. A movie starring Meryl Streep, and she goes on a cruise with Diane Wiest and Candice Bergen and Lucas Hedges, and Gemma Chan tags along. It's an amazing cast. It looks just like Ocean's 11. It's did I mention it's a Steven Soderbergh movie?
Oh, now I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
it's great. It's on HBO Max. It's very contained. It's shot just like Ocean's 11, so it just visually it feels like that vibe visually, but on a boat. And the stakes are just this author brings all her friends on a boat trip because she's afraid to fly. And you find out why at the end of the movie. They're taking this boat. They're on the Queen Mary 2 going from the U.S. to England so that Meryl Streep's character can win an award. And all kinds of stuff happens on the boat, and she and her friends don't like each other. It's really, really good. And no one talks about it because it came out during the pandemic. But I bet if this came out in theaters, people would have really liked it. Anyway, back to His Girl Friday. Yeah, I gave it 3.5. I liked it, but I didn't love it. I like journalism movies too. I'm also a bit in the bag for them, and we'll get into that more. We've teased this so many times, but when we get to Ace in the Hole, the Kirk Douglas movie, we'll talk about that a lot. But this does a lot in a more funny way of the same thing that the Douglas movie does, which talks about like what Nightcrawler does, which talks about the sort of nastiness of journalism.
No, zero Oscar love for this movie. Really, no awards of any kind at the time it came out. It was kind of absolutely nothing. But in the '90s, it was added to the National Film Registry. So
it's so interesting. I don't know if we mentioned it, but the movie was directed by Howard Hawks, who is one of the most famous and prolific directors of all time.
Yeah.
This is the first Hawks movie I ever saw. So so thanks for helping me break my cherry.
You're welcome.
You did it so gently. It's interesting because in the 40s or late 30s, early 40s, I felt like the Oscars were much more likely to give Oscars to comedies than they are now even. So
yeah, at least not even like a screenplay or something, just anything at all.
Very strange. All right, well, let's transition to a movie that did get some Oscar love, which is surprising because this actor, director, writer, producer did not in his career get very much Oscar love, but we're talking about now Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator.
Yeah, tell me why you picked that for me.
So when I was in high school or maybe even middle school, they showed us the final speech from this movie to talk about democracy versus fascism, and I had forgotten that until I rewatched it last week for this podcast. But I wanted to talk about it because it's Chaplin's first real talkie. It was his first foray into a feature-length film without the tramp character, even though one of the two characters he plays is dressed just like the tramp, although there's a lot of discussion about whether or not it actually is the character of the Jewish barber. We've talked about a Holocaust movie on this podcast already. We talked about Schindler's List. This isn't a Holocaust movie per se. It's more of a movie about what happened in Germany, or well, they have a fake name for it, but it's Germany between World War I and World War II, and at the beginning of World War II, the ghettoization of the Jews. And I find that really interesting. I saw The Zone of Interest last night, so it felt very much of a piece with this. I won't talk about Zone of Interest because you haven't seen it, but
unfortunately, true.
Yeah, and it's considered one of the greatest movies by a lot of folks, and for sure one of the best movies about fascism. Without it, we don't get a lot of the satire that would come later. We talked on our producers episode a little bit about this movie because it opened the door for people. And if you watch this, you'll see Brooks was so influenced by Chaplin.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. I was shocked you hadn't seen it.
Me too.
And I just figured it would have come up like in a class, either, in college or whatever. And it's such an easy watch. But just real quick, Chaplin plays dual characters. He plays a Jewish barber who fights in World War I for the Germans, but is injured and then has amnesia between World War I and World War II and doesn't know about the rise of fascism in his country. And he also plays the fascist dictator of said country, which is called like Transnistria, or anyway, the fascist dictator's name is Adenoid Hinkel, which is obviously a play on Adolf Hitler. This came out in 1940, so it was during the war, during Hitler's height of his power. Tamania is the name of the country.
Oh yeah, Tamania.
Tamania. And he does both really well. He does a lot of like taking the piss out of Hitler while still making him seem, a little bit scary. He's got a Mussolini character in here called Benzino Napoleone. He's got a Goebbels character. He's got all kinds of Nazi analogs. And then he's got the Jewish ghetto stuff where he and his then wife, Paulette Goddard, who we talked about a bit because she also appeared in Modern Times, still looking as much from the future as ever.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. And I loved it. It's really terrific. What'd you think of it?
I loved it too. I thought it was, extremely funny. Even, I think I texted you this. I was so impressed by the opening sequence. The war sequences I thought were really, really well done. Because again, it's war. It's World War I, which, as we know, we covered All Quiet on the Western Front, both versions. We know how horrifying World War I was, but they made some really funny scenes around World War I, like when he's flying in the plane and they go upside down, and he's trying to check his pocket watch, but the plane is upside down. So I love that kind of stuff.
I'm not totally sure I understand how they did it. So what I assume happened in this scene where the plane is flying upside down and all these things are falling out of the plane, and then for a second the Jewish barber is hanging from the plane. So I assume they shot it upside down and then turned it the other way, but it's just like a crazy shot. The stunts, this isn't a silent film and it doesn't look like a silent film, but it has the slapstick of a silent film and it's Chaplin. And the stunts that are done from that era of comedy, just, and even drama, like we talked about, The Thief of Baghdad a few months ago.
Mhm.
I don't know how they did that kind of stuff back then.
Right. Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, Hollywood movie magic. It really stands the test of time. And you know what's really cool about that is they look just as impressive now as they did then, which makes them more impressive than the stuff that's happening now.
They do, yeah, because now we know how they're doing it. They're
right,
just designing it on computers.
Right, or painting out wires or whatever. Painting out wires in a best case scenario. I don't say that to diminish the work that computer artists, the 3D artists do. It's incredible. But in a most like seamless, you can't
We
see
just know so much more about it. The curtain's been pulled back so much more, that sort of thing.
For sure. And yet somehow, because this stuff is so old and I'm not familiar with how it was done, it feels more like magic to me than the stuff that we see now, but that we do know because we watch, visual artists react videos on YouTube and stuff like that. Or we know Mike Tanzillo, who tells us how stuff gets done on animated movies. It's very cool. And it's like we said, it's like super, super influential, especially in light of having just watched Modern Times. I really like that there was the Hinkle speeches were not actually in German. They're in gibberish. But they're made to sound like they're in German. I mean, there's some German words. He says like Wiener Schnitzel a lot.
Yeah.
But Chaplin studied Hitler's speeches to get the cadence of it right. And you can hear that even though he's just saying nonsense, it's that it's very much like that. And then that's Mel Brooks just ripped that right off for a lot of his stuff. And that reminded me of the scene at the end of Modern Times when he sings his gibberish song,
oh, right.
Wonderful Dance, which is my favorite part of that movie.
Glad we've covered so much. Well, I know we'll have a little more Chaplin coming up later, but yeah, it's been fun to go back and watch these and the speeches. Yeah, I mean, he's got a couple of long ones in there. Like that first one was, he's really good and funny. It's funny. There's a little bit of scary under there too, and he doesn't totally go goofball with it, even though it's mostly goofball.
Right. What I liked about it too, it is like you said, it's scary, it's menacing. But then when he talks about like the nuts and bolts of running his war, his conviction towards persecuting the Jews is like, if I can get money from them, I don't want to persecute them. Like he has no real convictions, and that fascism is really just a scheme. It's just a grift.
Right.
I love that. Now I truly believe that the Nazis hated the Jews, but I do like the idea that the leaders don't really care.
It's an interesting twist.
So it's interesting. You mentioned like you're happy that we're going back and seeing all this Chaplin stuff, much more so than although I think we might have another Buster Keaton movie coming up. We do, right? We're doing The General.
Yes, we do have The General coming up as well.
Right. And then who's the third guy?
Harold Lloyd.
Harold Lloyd. I mean, I think it makes sense that we're doing like just a little bit more Chaplin than we're doing Keaton and more of both of them than we are doing of Harold Lloyd. But Chaplin actually didn't direct that many feature-length films, especially by the standards of people of that time. Now, granted, he did like 80 shorts,
right.
He made like 80 movies. But feature-length, I think he only did 11, maybe 10.
Yeah, that sounds right.
So that's actually like a goal you could hit. You could very much make that happen. And his last film, I think, was with Brando and was not well received. But an interesting career. And this Modern Times, and we're going to cover The Gold Rush. Those are like the height. And then The Kid, which we're not going to cover on this podcast, but maybe we'll just talk about it after we watch The Gold Rush because they're from the same era.
Yeah, I mean Chaplin, he's like, he's like the Beatles of film. It's like everyone who became an actor like owes a little bit of something to Charlie Chaplin. So.
That makes a lot of sense. What Oscars did this get nominated for?
Well, it was nominated for 5 of them, and they were all, it lost all 5 of them. It was up for Best Picture, and it lost that to Rebecca, which is the only Alfred Hitchcock movie that ever won Best Picture. So it was up for Best Actor, Charlie Chaplin, of course, and that he lost to Jimmy Stewart from The Philadelphia Story, which I haven't seen, but yeah, it's Jimmy Stewart. So
you and I feel differently about him. I think Jimmy Stewart can be good, but is not always great.
Oh, I'm not saying one thing or another, but I'm just saying like, he won an Oscar in 1940. I mean, that's
what a surprise. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's what was going to happen. And, it's like, Meryl Streep winning for The Iron Lady. Ugh,
yeah. Right.
I love Meryl, but the movie was bad. Yeah. Jack Oakey was up for supporting actor. He was the one who kept taking the abuse from Henkel, the one who when he pulled all his medals off.
Mm-hmm. The big guy.
Yeah, that guy. He was up for supporting actor. He lost to Walter Brennan in a movie called The Westerner. Not familiar with that, but I know supporting actor was really recent. I think that was only like the second or third year they even had the category. And it was up for original screenplay, lost to a movie called The Great McGinty, written by Preston Sturges, a very famous writer. And then it was up for original score, which it lost to Pinocchio.
So I'm glad you brought up Pinocchio because I only have seen 4 feature-length films from 1940, and 2 of them we've talked about on this episode. But Pinocchio is far and away my favorite. It's also, as you know, if you listen to our episode where I ranked all the Disney movies, it is my favorite Disney animated film. I think it's one of the greatest movies of all time. I mean, at the very least, one of the greatest animated movies of all time. And then the other movie I've seen from this year is also a Disney movie because Fantasia also came out in 1940. And it's good, but I don't think it's as good as a lot of folks think it is.
I've seen 5 movies from 1940. A lot of overlap with your list, but I was able to make a top 5. And what's interesting about my top 5 is I liked some of these movies more than you did. And all 5 of the movies in my top 5, I gave 5 stars to.
Oh, wow. You're a big 1940s fan.
So 1940, I guess, is my year. And my number 5 movie, like you said, some people like it more than you. I'm one of those people, is Fantasia is my number 5. My number 4 movie, and this is really hard for me to do, is The Great Dictator, having it that low. Number 3 is John Ford's The Grapes of Wrath.
Never did it.
Just an amazing adaptation. I love the book. I think the movie is incredible. Number 2 is Pinocchio. And then number 1 is, like I said, I love His Girl Friday. That's just one of my movies. So that's my number 1. But yeah, great year, 1940.
Another great movie in 1940 is a short film, and it won, I believe, Best Animated Short that year. And it's the only reason I've seen it is because I've watched all of the animated shorts up through, I think, like 1975. I'll finish this year, hopefully. It's called The Milky Way.
Yeah, I've seen that one.
Yes, you have. And I believe it's a Hanna-Barbera cartoon. William Hanna. Well, it was MGM, but later on that William Hanna was a producer on the film. And yeah, it's really good. It's about 3 cats floating around in space.
That's right. Yeah, that's a weird one. Viv, I watched that with Viv, I think several times when she was little. We used to watch that one quite a bit. Yeah, that's really fun.
Yeah, this has been Never Did It. Thank you for joining us. Next week, we'll be back with a gritty episode, some real man stuff in 1974. If you want to know what is coming out next week, go to our Letterboxd profile. You can find me at Brad Garoon on Letterboxd. I think, Jake, you're Jake Ziegler on Letterboxd.
Yep, it's Jake_Ziegler.
And both of us have pinned to our profiles our Never Did It podcast list. You could also just search for the Never Did It podcast list. And the 2 movies that will be discussed on next week's episode are always at the top of that list.
We have a Facebook page now as well. You can check that out at facebook.com/neverdiditpodcast. I'll be posting on that with new episodes and just fun updates from time to time about what we're watching and what's coming up.
So check that out. And thank you for joining us for Never Did It. I actually liked it quite a bit.